Thales of Miletus, circa 585 BC. Thales leaves us no writings in his own hand, and we know his work only from later chroniclers, who have preserved something of his thought. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Thales is that he's likely not a Greek, but a Phoenician. The Mediterranean world allowed for the intermingling of all sorts of different thinkers and doctrines, as Thales studied and taught in Egypt. He is not just a philosopher, but also a scientist. Again, it has to be emphasized. The social institution of philosophy didn't exist at this time. There was not a recognizable familiar type called the philosopher, because Thales is the first such type. The chief contributions of Thales to the sciences were geometrical proofs, but his chief contribution to posterity is nothing having to do with math or science. Thales' significance is that he creates philosophy by proposing a metaphysical hypothesis. He proposes a theory about the origin and basis of the world, that all is water. Quote, Greek philosophy seems to begin with a preposterous fancy, with the proposition that water is the origin and mother womb of all things. Is it really necessary to stop there and become serious? Yes, and for three reasons. Firstly, because the proposition does enunciate something about the origin of things. Secondly, because it does so without figure and fable. Thirdly, and lastly, because in it is contained, although only in the chrysalis state, the idea. Everything is one. The first mentioned reason leaves Thales still in the company of religious and superstitious people. The second, however, takes him out of this company and shows him to us as a natural philosopher. But by virtue of the third, Thales becomes the first Greek philosopher. If he had said, out of water, earth is evolved, we should only have a scientific hypothesis, a false one, though nevertheless difficult to refute. But he went beyond the scientific. In his presentation of this concept of unity through the hypothesis of water, Thales has not surmounted the low level of the physical discernments of his time, but at the best overleapt them. The deficient and unorganized observations of an empiric nature which Thales had made as to the occurrence and transformations of water, or to be more exact, of the moist, would not in the least have made possible or even suggested such an immense generalization. That which drove him to this generalization was a metaphysical dogma which had its origin in a mystic intuition, and which, together with the ever-renewed endeavors to express it better, we find in all philosophies, the proposition, everything is one. End quote. So Thales is the first philosopher because he leads the way in the methodology of representing the unity of existence. His intuition, all is one, is at the root of all philosophy, so long as we agree with Nietzsche in classifying philosophy as a kind of art that involves the reflection of external existence in the mirror of the internal. And since our internal world, when rendered artistically, is always the work of an impulse, that means it is always ruled by a single tyrannical thought, because all such impulses want to be ruler and act tyrannically. In Thales' case, all is water. This is not a scientific hypothesis, strictly speaking, even though Thales does literally mean that all physical material we encounter is a transformation of water, or its rarefaction. But Thales attempts something metaphysical when he tries to articulate the notion that there is a substance to being, a universal reality that forms the ground of all being. The remarkable thing about Thales is that he allows his scientific drive for inquiry to manifest itself in this artistic way. The philosopher is essentially artistic because he renders an image. It is an image formed through the concept rather than set into marble, but nevertheless it is a representation that comes from the subjectivity of the philosopher. The claim all is water would not stand up to empirical scrutiny. Rather, it is thinking that partakes readily of a poetic license. Nietzsche says that, quote, What the verse is to the poet, dialectic thinking is to the philosopher. He snatches at it in order to hold fast his enchantment, in order to petrify it." End quote. Nietzsche invites us to consider an artist contemplating the waters flowing and breaking as a waterfall splashes down a mountain. Quote, "One might imagine the creating artist standing near a waterfall and seeing in the forms which leap towards him an artistically prefiguring game of the water with human and animal bodies, masks, plants, rocks, nymphs, griffins, and with all existing types in general, so that to him the proposition, 'everything is water,' is confirmed. The thought of Thales has rather its value, even after the perception of its indemonstrableness, the very fact that it was meant unmythically and unallegorically." End quote. So the important distinction between the philosopher and all the types that have come before is the fact that he does not lapse into myth and story. It is not that Thales reasons through a dispassionate logic to reach an indisputable conclusion. Rather, Thales takes a poetic leap. He overcomes the personifications, metaphors, and cosmogonies of Greek culture. He doesn't accomplish this through the sciences. In some sense, the question that Thales concerns himself with, what is the origin of all things, is not a scientific question in the first place, and the sciences cannot help him here. His answer draws upon the phenomenal world as an explanation of the phenomenal. This choice is no more or less justified than the mythological, we could say, but that's precisely why his great leap is so remarkable, in contradistinction to his time. In a culture where everyone views the origin of all things as the act of personified deities, as the work of Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite, Thales looks to a natural phenomenon as the origin of all things. Nevertheless, we can perhaps see the logic in suggesting water as the origin, in spite of its indemonstrableness, as Nietzsche puts it, since we could easily see how, when water is absorbed by the soil, plants grow. We need water to survive. All living beings do. The oceans are teeming with life. It seems as though water is the thing from which living things spring. We can also see how wet or moist soil eventually hardens and dries. One might begin to get the notion that once there was only water, there was an undifferentiated mass of that which is moist, and then the earth dried and hardened out of it, the living things grew out of it. Even evaporation could be seen as the explanation for how the air is formed. It is heated water, and so on and so forth. And so we see in Thales a mind which is not chaotic and irrational. There's a logic to his approach. We could call it a form of artistic reasoning. There's an important sense in which the philosopher is not just a development on the scientist, he's not just a development on the religious type, and he's not, strictly speaking, just an artist. The philosopher draws on aspects of all three of these and simultaneously leaps beyond all three. He is arbitrarily creative like the artist. He follows his reason like the scientist, and he aims to encompass the whole of reality like the mythmakers. It's not easy to summarize this relationship in one sentence, but perhaps we can say the philosopher perceives, maybe even just on some intuitive or unconscious level, that what's common to all three types is a depiction of reality. And the philosopher aims to do the same thing, but in his own way, in a new way. Nietzsche writes, quote, "When Thales says, 'everything is water,' man is startled up out of his worm-like mauling of and crawling about among the individual sciences. He divines the last solution of things and masters through this divination the common perplexity of the lower grades of knowledge. The philosopher tries to make the total chord of the universe re-echo within himself, and then to project it onto ideas outside himself. Whilst he is contemplative like the creating artist, sympathetic like the religionist, looking out for ends and causalities like the scientific man, whilst he feels himself swell up to the macrocosm, he still retains the circumspection to contemplate himself coldly as the reflex of the world. He retains that cool-headedness, which the dramatic artist possesses when he transforms himself into other bodies, speaks out of them, and yet knows how to project this transformation outside himself into written verses." End quote. So, a couple things to comment on in that passage. Again, Nietzsche speaks at length of the blending of the artistic, scientific, and religious type within the philosopher. The notion of the scientific man boring through the earth like a worm is an allegory that Nietzsche would return to time and again. In his essay on Truth and Lies in the Extramoral Sense, he talks of the sciences as digging in their own individual mine shafts. Science is a bringing down of one's perspective to the level of the smallest detail. The various sciences, as each discipline becomes specialized, they become concerned with smaller and smaller distinctions and nuances. To encompass the whole of reality is, in some sense, unscientific, and thus any time somebody dares to give a description of existence itself, or the universe itself, one necessarily has to go beyond the sciences and become philosophical, even as they draw upon the power of the sciences to seek out the causes and reasons for everything. It's a leap into the creative, because creative license always must be used, and that's true no matter how much science one knows or brings into their description of the world. To say, for example, "We are all molecules in motion," perhaps the kind of phrase we might hear from a modern scientific materialist. Well, that phrase singles out one level of material existence, the level of the molecule, and makes that primary. It also tables the mystery of why there's motion at all, simply asserts that motion exists as a kind of truism. And so in the statement, "we are molecules in motion," we have a selective focus on one part of reality while obscuring the rest, which is an artistic choice. And so however clinical such a phrasing may sound, a poetic distortion of reality takes place in that phrasing. Further, such a statement posits motion as a brute fact. It becomes a sort of axiomatic mystery of existence. So we have an artistic claim and a religious sensibility contained in such an apparently scientific statement. Such a statement is a great leap. Thales, as preposterous as his initial assumption seems, is doing the same thing. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Thus the expression of every deep philosophical intuition by means of dialectics and scientific reflection is, it is true, on the one hand the only means to communicate what has been seen, but on the other hand it is a paltry means, and at the bottom a metaphorical, absolutely inexact translation into a different sphere and language." End quote. Considering metaphorical thinking, the metaphor of the leap to describe philosophy is particularly important in this essay. Nietzsche uses the metaphor of two men attempting to cross a river by different methods. The first man, quote, "light-footed, leaps over it using the stones and swinging himself upon them ever further and further, though they precipitously sink into the depths behind him." End quote. The second man calculates instead that he must first, quote, "build a pathway which will bear his heavy, weary step." End quote. The first man is like Thales and all the Pre-Platonics that we will discuss in this essay. The second man represents Plato and all those philosophers who come after Plato, the post-Platonics. Thales shows the way forward with his hypothesis because the whole of reality is depicted in the form of the concept, and Nietzsche understands this to be a creative, arbitrary, artistic act, rather than a dialectical movement of the mind towards a greater truth, or however a Platonist or a Hegelian philosopher might understand it. This is the significance of Thales. He's the first one of the Greek canon of writers who does this, and so in spite of the fact that there are no Thalians around today promoting the aquatic theory of material existence, in some sense we are all Thalians, to the extent that any philosopher who tries to encompass reality in an idea is following the course of Thales. To sum up this figure and his significance, Nietzsche writes, quote, Thales saw the unity of the existent, and when he wanted to communicate this idea, he talked of water. End quote. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.